One of the big criticisms of nationalism is that, well, critics will say it increases the incidence of war. And really, there hasn't been, let me just say it this way, there hasn't been a great power war since World War II. The US and Russia didn't fight all the way through Cold War. I mean, they yelled at each other and threw shoes at each other, but they didn't really fight a war. If we think about war since World War II, it's been it's been a lot of ethnic nationalism that is sort of let me say it this way. In the 1960s and the 70s, it was about decolonization, and it was about new states forming. And if I'm Kenya and I'm going to form a new state of Kenya, what do I have to form? I'm a nation state. I have to form the nation of Kenya, what it means to be Kenyan. That's not just something obvious. That's going to be a bunch of different groups, tribes, whatever. We have to come together and form Kenya. We saw this in Afghanistan, that when we went into Afghanistan, you looked around, there actually weren't a lot of Afghans. There was a lot of Pashtuns, there was a lot of Uzbeks, but there weren't a lot of people who saw themselves as Afghan. So it's this creation of this thing here, which often means leaving behind old loyalties, which can cause war, or it means shaping what does it mean to be Kenyan. So what about that group over there? Nah, they're not Kenyan. War. Or this group over here that do you guys claim? We claim them too. War. In other words, this sort of forming, if power is really what it's all about, and power is decided by states, then what the nation is becomes super, super important in the whole thing. And it becomes a reason for and a cause of war. That's what the critics are going to claim. That creating an us, so nationalism is really all about unifying an us, that's the positive side. But what that always does is that creates a them, somebody that we are not, that likely poses a threat to the us. And so we do see this sort of interstate war and ethnic violence, this sort of outbreak that has happened, especially even since the end of the Cold War, but we could say all the way back to World War II. So one term might be Balkanization, which Yugoslavia in the Cold War was sort of unified by communism. But when communism collapsed at the end of the Cold War, a bunch of different states sort of not just went out and formed their own state like Bosnia-Herzegovina or Croatia or Slovenia, they violently broke away because now it became, this is my territory. No, this is my territory. These are my people. No, those are my people. And it became quite a fight to sort of see what the outcome's going to be, Balkanization. Another thing that we see, obviously, is genocide and ethnic cleansing. And if you need something to look at for that, look up the Rohingya and just read a few things about that, and you will sort of see the messiness that can be caused by this process of the us-them and nationalism. You can also add into this economic and cultural colonialism. It doesn't have to be like outright, it can be outright violence, but it can be overt or even covert sort of global racism, where there's this idea of we're better than them. Or I could draw my liberalism arrow. Here's us, here's them. Based on this liberalism arrow, who's cooler? The United States. Who's less cool? Them, whoever them is. And that can be tied to race, and that can be racist, and that can be really problematic as well. Now, is this true? The critics say this is true. Is it true? It's a hard thing to say because we live in a world of nationalism. And so, yes, but we don't want to, is that really the cause of it? Can you create an us? Well, of course, creating an us always creates a them. Can you do that in a way that doesn't necessarily lead to war and ethnic violence? One more slide. So here's another criticism of nationalism, and that is this. So if the job of nationalism is to unify a group of individuals into an us, into a we, then, and we know nationalism is relatively new, then aren't there better ways of unifying people into nationalism? Aren't there better unifying ideologies? And so we'll actually see this. You can find books and articles all over the place where people say, instead of national, they might not say it this way, but instead of nationalism, here's how we should organize. So, for example, here's the easiest one because we've talked about it before, and that's Karl Marx. We should organize by class. Nations and states are just tools of worker exploitation. So screw nations, screw states, they separate the proletariat from each other and give all the power to the bourgeoisie. So we should organize by class. That's one argument. You might not be a Marxist, so you might not like that. Another argument might be, a better unifying ideology might be women. Some forms of feminism will talk about this. Again, not that women would form a different group against the men and sort of form their own state or anything like that. You wouldn't necessarily need states because we're moving away from nation states. So what would be the new organizing principle? Another might be believers. So religious movements like Islam, or what we might call global Islamism. That's what Al-Qaeda was global Islamism. We need to have Sharia law all over the world. So don't organize by nations. I shouldn't be an Egyptian. I'm Islamic. I'm not an American. I'm a Christian. Well, that's going to be a tough one for some of you guys when I say it that way, because right now you might not see a difference between American, I shouldn't say it that way. You might not see a contradiction between American and Christian, but what if there was? Which wins? And that's a tricky question. Another one we've talked about is just humanity. This could be the unifying ideology, cosmopolitanism, that why are we in teams at all? Shouldn't we just sort of be one people? Let's erase all those borders. Let's sort of make the world the world. I mean, when you think about it, it's kind of made up. If we can imagine these communities called nations, can't we imagine that there are no communities, that we're just human beings? So that's the thing. The question then becomes, are these really better than nationalism? Are we going to see in the near future nationalism becoming less important as a way of organizing human beings at the global level? Or will it become more important? In fact, maybe even to the point where we get some of these, those negative tendencies on the last page. Forget it. You know what I mean. I'd go back to the last page, but I really can't do that right now because it's not behaving. So that is it. That's week 2 in the books. I hope you guys are still doing well with classes. Again, please let me know if we can do things better. And that's it. I really appreciate you guys. Can I just say very quickly, I appreciate you guys for the energy you're putting into this and the effort you're putting into this. I know that the novel is wearing off at this point, but it's still important stuff to talk about and think about. And while we're just sort of scratching the surface, these are really important questions that if you just pick up the newspaper or pick up the internet, if that's possible, you can start to see these things out there and have a better grasp on what is trying to be worked out, talked about. Okay, I will see you guys later. Maybe. Can't make it work. Oh my gosh, this is ridiculous.